My name is Donald Clark. I'm local, born in Kenton, Delaware. Today is October the 24th of 2009, and I attended Dover High School in Dover, Delaware. And it's that time that I became interested in Dover Air Force Base, which was at one time was started as a civilian school for a civilian base rather for the city of Dover, and then after December the 7th of 1941 the U.S. Air Corps took it over. And as I remembered coming out from the high school during lunchtime, that they had one runway here at that time with B-25 bombers that flew from this field for submarine patrol. And while attending Dover High School, they had just finished a field house in which they had 2 basketball courts in it. And we had played several games on the new building, but then all of a sudden here the trucks arrived with bringing in cots, and it was used from till the time that they had some barracks suitable for the soldiers to live in at the base. They lived at the field house on Dover High School, which is now Dover Middle School. I took my examinations for aviation cadet training in October of 1942. I was a senior at high school, and I passed them. And they told me at that time that I would be called up after I graduated from high school. Instead, that on February the 12th of 1943, I was called to active duty in the U.S. Air Corps. And at that time, the legislature in the state of Delaware had passed a law saying that if a student served over half of his school year satisfactorily, they'd give him his diploma. So my mother received that diploma for me, and by that time I was at Birmingham Southern College in Birmingham, Alabama, and what the Air Force had is civilian training detachment. In other words, what it really backed up to be, we had academic subjects throughout the 6 months course that we were there, but what it really backed up to, the Air Force had it as a holding pattern or a holding group so that they could get a hold of the trainees when they wanted it and how many they needed and wanted. When we were entered into military service, we were not aviation cadets. We were privates. And then when when they sent us to CTD, the College Training Detachment, well, then we were then called aviation students. And then after we finished that and went to classification center and we passed that, well, then we were then aviation cadets. Then we started our training, our flight training and pre-flight training from there on. The training of a troop carrier early on, as I read history, it was, well, they kind of learned on the spot of what to do. However, when I was put into troop carrier, they did have three schools up in the United States. And they just put a new one up at Malden, Missouri that I went to. It had been a basic flight school, and they closed it and opened up a troop carrier training. And what they did, they had 3 phases in there. The first phase was 50 hours in the C-47. Everybody went into the first phase. We even had a advanced flying school in Eden, Oklahoma. All the instructors were in there during the first phase also. They were bringing pilots in from everywhere. And later I found out from reading the history that we had pilots coming out of our ears when we first entered the outfit in France, but they claimed that they had canceled anywhere from 14 to 20 drops. In other words, if they had carried on with those numbered parachute drops and glider tows at 14 to 20, they would have used up quite a bit of the excess pilots. So anyhow, after the 50 hours, you're either selected as a first pilot or your co-pilot. I was selected as the first pilot. In the third phase, we picked up a radio operator and engineer, and we covered everything 7 days a week. 1 week we'd fly in the morning, next week in the afternoon, the next week at night, then reverse that back again. We did all of our flying even night and day around 500 feet, and all the aircraft were loaded with sandbags to maximum weight so that you knew what it was with the whole thing. Now and they would slow us down to 120 miles an hour indicated, because that was the speed that they didn't want to exceed that speed to drop paratroopers or to tow gliders. And that was not too much above stall speed. And matter of fact, if you're in a position in the left wing of the left element and you're making a turn to the left, you were down to maybe 100 miles an hour, your flaps down, gear down, everything else, and praying by God you weren't going to stall because you didn't have enough room to recover. We covered everything from really very, very thorough training. In other words, in flying in troop carrier, you had to use everything you'd ever learned in training, plus. In other words, you'd fly in the bombers, you'd take off and fly formation, drop your bombs, come back and land. But for a troop carrier, we're just like being a bush pilot. And some of the fields were so small that we had to go into 3-point landings with a C-47, which the aircraft is built for only wheel landings. And that's enough to scare you to death to start off with. But anyhow, it was most thorough training that we had. When we went over there, we were thoroughly trained very well. Much better than some of the older guys have been there, that they didn't have these schools set up. They didn't know what to do. They know how to fly formation and drop their paratroopers or drop their gliders, and that was that. And one of the interesting things that somebody asked me at the museum, they said, well, you carry 800 gallons of gasoline in jerry cans to Patton or whoever. How many gallons does it take of this aircraft to fly him 800 gallons? Well, I did not know the answer, so that night I went home and had some old maps and figured it out, the average distance from D-Day to D-Day locations in Germany. And using the amount of gallons we used per hour, I figured it took us an average of 650 gallons for each airplane to fly him 800 gallons. During the war, with the 441st Troop Carrier Group, 302nd Squadron of the 50th Wing in France. My specialty and job, I was a first pilot, or what they call aircraft commanders in today's language, and of C-47 aircraft. Well, after we landed in England, went to a depot for 7 days, and at that time I assumed that they tried to find out where we were needed. So we were then flown from there to Dreux, France, 75 miles west of Paris, which was a troop carrier station, and that was my first assignment. I was stationed at several different airfields in France near the German border, and after the war was stationed at Villa Couplay at Paris, Orly Field at Paris, and that was it. I had 27 accredited combat missions out of 81. It was all resupply missions, which we were supplying gasoline and ammunition to the tank units at the front. Yeah, Patton was very, very strict, even during the combat. There would be many a morning we would be to take in gasoline and ammunition. And at briefing, they'd say, well, you're going to these airfields at a certain location. but Patton says they're not taken yet, but when you get there, he'll have them taken. And that was true, even though that the little white flags would be lined up this grass field, which are mostly German fighter fields, which are very small. And just as long as we stayed and landed between those white flags, everything was all right. And most of them were up corridors. In other words, those corridors would be 5 to 8 miles wide and up to 35 to 40 miles long. So therefore, the procedure that we went through would fly V's, formation of V's, and then about 50 miles out or 90 miles out, we'd break up and drop right down on the treetops, flying at random, and till we got to the airfield, and we'd land, unload, and leave there. And then a lot of times we had a flight nurse on board and a technician. We would pick up wounded and fly them back to Reims, France, or if they're really bad cases, to be flown directly to England. And I might say at this point too that the flight nurses never got the recognition they so deserved. They were not supposed to be on those flights, according to the Geneva Convention. Those flights, if they were flying medical supplies in, wounded out, you could fly a Red Cross flag, and the flight nurses would be on those ships. But there's mission after mission after mission that these flight nurses and the tech would be on board. And there also was one case where there's one flight nurse who was a prisoner of war in Germany. And that's quite another story that could very well, a movie could have been made out of that, where the Germans didn't know what to do with her. I mean, here they got this woman, you know. They treated her nice, and that's another big story. And then Patton. They claim that he had less percentage of casualties than any other unit, which I don't know whether that's true or not. But I do know that within 7 days or a week before the end of the war, even though we were still flying gasoline, ammo, and extracting wounded, we had to then get off the airplane with our necktie on, which was really unusual.
Why did you have to
That
wear
was his order. Well, you know Patton.
Was there also something about the gasoline you had mentioned before, about supplying gasoline to Patton and with Patton's push to Berlin? Could you explain a little bit about that?
Oh yes, there are several days that I didn't understand why it was. I asked different persons, they didn't know. But we would sit loaded with gasoline for a couple of days and not move. Just sit on under the wing waiting for orders to leave. Well, I later found out that after the war, when I started reminiscing and trying to find out a lot of the questions I had during the war, I found out that that was the only way they kept Patton from getting caught. In other words, get caught behind the lines with his pants down. Now, either his son or son-in-law did get caught at a place called Kreilsheim, Germany. And it was around 35 miles, if I remember correctly, behind the lines. And our squadron, I did not participate in it, but our squadron sent 6 airplanes up there with gasoline and ammo on with a P-47 escort and landed at this small ex-Luftwaffe fighter field and supplied them with gasoline and ammo so they could fight their way out. And the P-47 boys, I never saw any ice cream the whole time I was overseas, but our CO found ice cream somewheres and flew the P-47 outfit all the ice cream they could eat, and we didn't get any. Oh, well, whatever. Then that was interesting. But Patton, he would have been to Berlin, no question about it, and they would have caught him too, and he had been ended his career too right there.